Hey there, amazing people. I'm thrilled to have you here today. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of I. Bernard Cohen. We hope you find it enlightening. I. Bernard Cohen, 1 March 1914 – 20 June 2003, was an American historian of science. He taught at Harvard University for 60 years, becoming the first chair of its Department of the History of Science when it was established in 1966, and he mentored notable students including George Basalla, Lorraine Daston, and Alan G. Debus. He was the author of many books on the history of science and, in particular, on Isaac Newton, Benjamin Franklin, and Howard H. Aiken. He made a full English translation of Newton's Principia Mathematica and was the second chief editor of the History of Science journal ISIS. As we transition, let's shed light on early life and education and its relevance to our ongoing exploration. I. Bernard Cohen was born 1 March 1914 in Far Rockaway, New York City, to Isidore and Blanche Cohen. He had one older sister, Harriet. His father died just before Cohen's bar mitzvah at age 12, and Cohen became unmotivated and spent the next years performing unremarkably in schools and early jobs. He attended Columbia Grammar School through 1929 and then spent one semester at New York University before transferring to Farmingdale Agricultural Institute on Long Island for veterinary medicine. This also did not work out, so he returned to New York University but then dropped out and became a probation rum runner while living with relatives in Connecticut. After nearly being shot while unloading rum, he enrolled in Valley Forge Military Academy and began to take his studies more seriously, graduating at the top of his class in 1933. Cohen next attended Harvard University, where he intended to become a theoretical or mathematical chemical physicist and became a protege of George D. Birkhoff. He graduated in 1937 with Obs. in mathematics and honors in history, with an undergraduate thesis The Billiard Ball Problem and the Recurrence Property of Dynamical Systems advised by Birkhoff. He moved directly into Harvard's NUFT program in the history of science, the first in the U.S., and became the first American to receive a FT in the history of science in 1947. In this time, Cohen worked closely with historian of science George Basalla, founder of the History of Science Society and founder of the journal ISIS, becoming his personal assistant. In 1941, petitioning Harvard President James B. Conant to support Cohen in a teaching position, Basalla wrote, "Cohen was the best disciple I have had thus far out of a selected group of about 1,000 men. He is also the only one whom I could train completely, and his preparation for work in my field is as good as could be from every point of view, scientific, philosophic, historical, and linguistic." Teaching duties beginning 1942 and secret work for the U.S. in World War I took his attention off his dissertation research for years, and in the end his final thesis in 1947 was his already published 1941 edited volume Benjamin Franklin's Experiments, a new edition of Franklin's Experiments and Observations on Electricity, edited, with a critical and historical introduction. In the upcoming section, we'll be shining a light on career. Cohen taught at Harvard from 1942 through his retirement emeritus in 1984, then at the Harvard Extension School and many visiting positions, until his hospitalization for terminal illness in 2002. He was the first chairman of Harvard's Department of the History of Science, and he rose to the position of Victor South Thomas Professor of the History of Science at Harvard in 1977. During his tenure, he developed Harvard's general education program and its program in the history of science. Cohen succeeded George Basalla as editor of ISIS and, later, served as president of the History of Science Society. Cohen was also a president of the International Union of History and Philosophy of Science. In 1973 he gave 3 lectures for the A.S.W. Rosenbach Lectures in Bibliography. In 1974, he was awarded the Sarton Medal by the History of Science Society. He was awarded the 1986 Pfizer Award for his book Revolutions in Science. He became a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1952 and of the American Philosophical Society in 1995. Cohen's scholarship ranged from science and public policy to the history of computers, with particular concentrations in the study of Isaac Newton and early American science, and several decades as a special consultant for history of computing with IBM. He published over 150 articles and over 20 books. The books included Franklin and Newton 1956, The Birth of a New Physics 1960, The Newtonian Revolution 1980, Revolution in Science 1985, Science and the Founding Fathers 1995, Howard Aiken, Portrait of a Computer Pioneer 1999, and The Triumph of Numbers 2005. He considered his work editing and translating Newton's Philosophy Naturalis Principia Mathematica to be his most important. With the groundwork laid, let's now examine teaching and its connections to our previous discussions. Cohen began teaching at Harvard in 1942 as a teaching fellow and then an instructor in physics, while still a graduate student. He received tenure in 1953 and became the first chairman of Harvard's Department of the History of Science when it was established in 1966. He became Victor South Thomas Professor of the History of Science at Harvard in 1977 and retired emeritus in 1984. Harvard's President James B. Conant initially asked Sarton and Cohen to focus on teaching undergraduates in the history of science rather than graduate students because Conant worried that FTs in the history of science could not find employment until the history of science was firmly established as a field in courses at the undergraduate level. For a time in the ERS, Cohen said he was in charge of all elementary laboratory work at Harvard civilians, Army ASTP, and Navy V students at the peak. During this time, he prepared a book on the applications of science for laymen titled Science, Servant of Man, published 1948. Cohen's early teaching work developed the undergraduate general education program at Harvard. He served as a research assistant to Conant on Conant's own work on general education, for instance Conant's Terry Lectures at Yale University, which Conant adapted into a general education course of his own on understanding science, then into the short book on understanding science and historical approach 1947, and then the longer Science and Common Sense 1951. Cohen also served as a consultant to the faculty committee that established general education at Harvard and edited General Education in Science 1952 with Fletcher Watson. He taught his own original General Education History of Science course with an attendance of hundreds titled The Nature and Growth of the Sciences for years and published its original textbook, with the same title, in 1954. Cohen supervised the doctoral dissertations of Lorraine Daston, Alan G. Debus, Judith Grabiner, Kenneth Manning, Jutta Merzbock, Dwayne H. D. Roller, Joan L. Richards, and Helen L. Thomas. Among Cohen's other students and critics were the Islamic philosopher Syed Hossein Nasser, Tufts University professor George East Smith, Bucknell University professor Martha Verbrugge, and Jeremy Bernstein. While teaching for Harvard, Cohen adapted his teaching materials for larger audiences. Cohen wrote 13 general interest essays published in Scientific American between 1948 and 1992. Cohen's April 1955 interview with Albert Einstein for the July 1955 Scientific American was the last Einstein gave before his death. In March 1984, Scientific American published an essay by Cohen on Florence Nightingale and her contributions to social statistics. In the ERS, Cohen became general editor of a 5-volume series to provide albums of educational illustrations for classes in the history of science, a project inspired and led by Charles Scribner, Jr., and contributed his own volume to the series, From Leonardo to Lavoisier, 1980. After his retirement from Harvard, Cohen taught at the Harvard Extension School and at many visiting positions until his hospitalization for terminal illness in 2002 interrupted his final classes. As we progress through this video, let's shift our attention towards Isaac Newton and uncover its hidden depths. Cohen was an internationally recognized Isaac Newton scholar. He co-authored a 900-page 1972 volume edition of Newton's Philosophy Naturalis Principia Mathematica begun with Alexander Cohen and a 974-page 1999 English translation of the full Principia, begun in collaboration with the Latinist and Whitman. Many, including Cohen, considered this translation to be his most important work. Cohen also published books on Newton such as The Birth of a New Physics 1959, Introduction to Newton's Principia 1971, and The Newtonian Revolution 1980, and he co-edited volumes on Newton such as Isaac Newton's Papers and Letters in Natural Philosophy 1958, second edition 1978, Newton, Texts, Backgrounds, Commentaries 1996, with Richard South. Westfall, Isaac Newton's Natural Philosophy 2000, with Jed Buchwald, and the Cambridge Companion to Newton 2002, with George East. Smith. Cohen stated his interest in Newton had been inspired by George D. Birkhoff's teaching while he was an undergraduate. His professional work on Newton began via his dissertation work on Benjamin Franklin, particularly the influence of Newton's optics on Franklin. His first published work on Newton was Newton and the Modern World in the American Scholar in 1942. This interest then developed under the mentorship of Alexander Cohen, who Cohen met via Massachusetts Institute of Technology historian and philosopher Giorgio de Santillana. Cohen and Cohen's first collaboration was on Cohen's paper Galileo and Plato in the Journal of the History of Ideas 1943, but they next moved to a letter from Robert Hooke to Newton, and soon Cohen wrote a letter of recommendation for John Farquhar Fulton's effort to recruit Cohen to Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, which ensured Cohen a place to work in America. Cohen and Cohen decided to begin the project of preparing a volume edition of the Philosophy Naturalis Principia Mathematica in 1956, and Cohen took leadership of the project after Cohen's death in 1964. They had also planned a joint commentary, but it was never begun. In 1959, Cohen's work on the project brought him into lifelong friendship and collaboration with a graduate student, later an internationally recognized authority on Newton's mathematical work, Derek T. Whiteside. After Cohen's death, Cohen sought assistance from Harvard B. a 1959 Latinist and Whitman on the project. During the preparation of this volume edition, he also produced his Introduction to Newton's Principia 1971 and a substantial biographical entry on Newton for the Dictionary of Scientific Biography 1974. He also began a translation project with Whitman that they continued together until her death in 1984. After completing the volume edition, Cohen's work on Newton focused on an interpretive work, The Newtonian Revolution, with illustrations of the transformation of scientific ideas 1980, which he had begun via his Wiles lectures at the University of Belfast in 1966. After Whitman's death, Cohen halted work on the new translation of Newton's Principia out of grief. However, after a prompt from his former student George East. Smith, he revived the project with the assistance of students and a former friend of Whitman's, classicist Julia Budins. The work was finally published in 1999, 30 years after it had begun, after review by Richard South, Westfall, Curtis Wilson, and Smith. It was the first New English translation of Newton's complete Principia since 1729, 270 years before. With our foundation established, it's time to explore early American science and its relevance to our overarching theme. Cohen began his professional scholarship with work on the science of Benjamin Franklin, and he continued to work on the science of the founding fathers of the United States late into his career. Cohen's debut book was the edited volume Benjamin Franklin's Experiments 1941, which became his doctoral dissertation in 1947, though he had planned a more extensive dissertation on the influence of Isaac Newton on Franklin, which eventually became the 1956 book Franklin and Newton after he had already received tenure in 1953. Benjamin Franklin's Experiments was based on the 5th English edition, London, 1774, of Franklin's experiments and observations made at Philadelphia, together with additional material, coming to roughly 275 pages, plus an original 160-page introduction by Cohen. Reviewers in Science and the English Historical Review praised both the introduction and the arrangement of material. Between the publication of Benjamin Franklin's Experiments and Franklin and Newton, Cohen also contributed to the establishment of Harvard's collection of historic scientific instruments, focusing on instruments of the 18th century, and prepared the book Some Early Tools of American Science, 1950. He also collaborated with Henry Gulick on a project titled American Science and the American Republic, but this was never finished and instead became material for the later works Science and American Society in the First Century of the Republic, 1961, and Science and the Founding Fathers, 1995. Science and the Founding Fathers was widely reviewed upon publication, with generally favorable reviews. Reviewers particularly valued Cohen's argument that scientific principles were used more as rhetorical metaphors and analogies rather than as genuine mechanical inspirations. The general interest of many rich anecdotes of 18th century intellectual history, such as Benjamin Franklin's invention of Polly Baker and Cohen's attention to debunking Woodrow Wilson's then popular characterization of the Constitution of the United States as a Newtonian document in his 1908 Constitutional Government in the United States, though historian of evolution John Celsius Green alleged a core error in Cohen's argument against Wilson's invocation of Darwinism. To a few reviewers, the material on Benjamin Franklin's interest in demography and its political applications, in particular, stood out as novel and valuable. Alongside the general praise, criticism from non-specialists focused on the specialist nature of the work, while criticism from specialists concerned its lack of novelty among specialists, with some specialist reviewers characterizing the book as sometimes repetitive in a schoolmaster style and also largely a reformulation of Cohen's prior publications. In this part of the video, we'll be delving deeper into computing and analyzing its key components. Cohen began his activity in the history of computing in around 1965 and spent several decades as a special consultant for history of computing with IBM. As of 1980, he was a member of the board of editors of the IEEE Annals of the History of Computing, a member of the American Federation of Information Processing Society's Committee on the History of Computing, and a member of the board of directors of the Charles Babbage Institute for the History of Information Processing. Cohen was exposed to the subject earlier and knew Howard Aiken as a graduate student, but his first major professional contribution was a 1967 official report for IBM comparing its collection of historic computers with other collections around the world. Get ready for a thought-provoking discussion as we delve into personal life and its impact on our understanding. Cohen married Frances Parsons Davis in 1944 and they remained married until her death in 1982. They had a daughter, Frances Bernard Cohen, who became a New York psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. He remarried in 1984 with the social worker Susan T. Johnson, gaining 2 stepsons. He died of the bone marrow disorder myelodysplasia in 2003. Now, let's redirect our focus towards general and discover its significance in our narrative. 1948 Science, Servant of Man, a layman's primer for the age of science Little, Brown, 1954 The Nature and Growth of the Physical Sciences Wiley, 1955-1960 The Birth of a New Physics Science Study Series, Anchor Books, Doubleday, W. W. Norton 1985 Revised ed. 1984 Alternative pagination depending on country of sale, 1985 Revolution in Science Belknap Press, 1985 Album of Science, From Leonardo to Lavoisier, Scribner, 1994 Interactions, Some Contacts Between the Natural Sciences and the Social Sciences, MIT Press, 2005. The Triumph of Numbers, How Counting Shaped Modern Life, W. W. Norton. Now, let's redirect our focus towards Isaac Newton and discover its significance in our narrative. 1940 to 1958 edited, Isaac Newton's Papers and Letters in Natural Philosophy, 2nd edition, Harvard University Press, 1978, 1971. Introduction to Newton's Principia, Harvard University Press, 1st ed. Universe, 1999 ed. 1972 edited, with Alexander Coyer and Anne Whitman, Philosophy Naturalis Principia Mathematica, Vol. IN2, 3rd edition, 1726, with variant readings, Harvard University Press, 1980. The Newtonian Revolution, with illustrations of the transformation of scientific ideas, Cambridge University Press, 1996, edited, with Richard South. Westfall, Newton, Texts, Backgrounds, Commentaries, Norton Critical Editions, W. W. Norton, 1999, translated, with Anne Whitman. The Principia, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, University of California Press, 2000, edited, with Jed Z. Buchwald. Isaac Newton's Natural Philosophy, MIT Press, 2002, edited, with George East Smith. The Cambridge Companion to Newton, Cambridge University Press. In this section, we'll be deep diving into early American science, unraveling its complexities and uncovering valuable insights. 1941 edited, Benjamin Franklin's Experiments, a new edition of Franklin's Experiments and Observations on Electricity, edited, with a critical and historical introduction, Harvard University Press, 1950. Some Early Tools of American Science, an account of the early scientific instruments and mineralogical and biological collections in Harvard University Press, 2014, reprint, ed. 1953. Benjamin Franklin, His Contribution to the American Tradition, Makers of the American Tradition Series, Bobbs Merrill, 1956. Franklin and Newton, An Inquiry into Speculative Newtonian Experimental Science and Franklin's Work in Electricity as an Example thereof, American Philosophical Society, 1961. Science and American Society in the First Century of the Republic, Ohio State University, 1976-1990. Benjamin Franklin's Science, Harvard University Press, 1995. Science and the Founding Fathers, Science in the Political Thought of Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, and Madison, W. W. Norton. Get ready for an enlightening exploration as we dig into computing and understand its role in the broader context. 1990-1999 Howard Aiken, Portrait of a Computer Pioneer, History of Computing, MIT Press, 1999, edited, with Gregory W. Welch, Making Numbers, Howard Aiken and the Computer, MIT Press. Share this video with your friends and spread the knowledge.